أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله فإن الله تعالى مع المتقين وبعد. The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he informed us amongst many things about something which we have spoken about many times from this minbar, and something which needs to be repeated many times again from this minbar. And in fact, if one were to remind himself or herself daily about this particular issue, it would only benefit him. The Prophet alayhi salatu salam, he said, إن الدنيا حلوة خضرة وإن الله مستخلفكم فيها فناظر كيف تعملون فاتقوا الدنيا واتقوا النساء. The Prophet alayhi salatu salam, أو كما قال, he said that this dunya is green and sweet. This dunya is lush and pleasant. And Allah Azza wa Jal has placed you in this dunya and is looking at how you are going to interact with it. And the Prophet ﷺ, he then said, فَاتَّقُوا الدُّنْيَا وَاتَّقُوا النِّسَاء. Therefore, protect yourself from a dunya, shield yourself from the dunya, and shield yourself, O men of Islam, from the fitna of women. And there are many aspects that can be discussed when we look at this hadith, but the aspect which I would like to focus on, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, فَاتَّقُوا الدُّنْيَا. He said, fear, we would translate it as perhaps the dunya, but taqwa does not actually mean taqwa does not actually mean fear. The ulama of Islam, they say that taqwa comes from wiqaya, which is to place a shield between yourself and that which you are trying to prevent yourself from receiving or seeing, and so on and so forth. And so it's create a buffer zone between yourself and this dunya. Shield yourself from this dunya. And likewise, shield yourself from women. Why? Because women, for men, are one of the main attractions of this dunya. And many a strong man has fallen victim to the vice of women. And no man is safe from his own desires. The one who feels safe from his own desires is the one closest to destruction. But the point, ad-dunya. And when we look to the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He does not praise the dunya, rather Allah Azza wa Jal, He rebukes those who indulge in the dunya. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when referring to one of the battles that took place during the lifetime of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, the battle of Uhud, wherein some of these Sahaba, as Allah Azza wa Jal tells us, were enticed by the dunya. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, مِنْكُمْ مَنْ يُرِيدُ الدُّنْيَا وَمِنْكُمْ مَنْ يُرِيدُ الْآخِرَةِ. From you are those who want this dunya, and from you are those who want this akhirah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the same passage informs us that He forgave the Sahaba. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgave the Sahaba, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about them in the Quran in various places. رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ. That Allah is pleased with them and they were pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and are pleased with Him in the akhirah. The point is not the Sahaba, the point is the lesson. And one of the contemporary scholars of Islam, when speaking about the relationship that we should have with the Quran, he says something which is very important and something which we miss today. Many of us, we memorize the Quran, we recite the Quran. In fact, now you may even say that memorizing the Quran has to a degree become a fashion, where you have young individuals who are pursuing the memorization of the Quran in multiple qira'at. Why? Because it's fashionable, ijazat and so on and so forth. But the Sahaba did not have such an endeavor. The Sahaba's endeavor was what? Self-rectification, rectification of society. And this contemporary scholar of Islam, he says that the Quran was revealed to fix the companions, to address the problems of the companions individually and collectively. And so when we read the Quran, we should try to read and understand what was happening here. In relation to what was this verse revealed, so that we can ourselves learn from it and apply it in our own lives. And so the Battle of Uhud, what happened? As we know, those who have visited perhaps, and those who have not visited, may Allah allow us all a visit. The companions, some of them, were placed on a mountain close to Uhud, the mountain of Uhud, and a battle ensued in that area. And the Prophet ﷺ instructed those companions, do not come down from that small mount, regardless of what happens. Even if you see that we on the battlefield are victorious, hold your positions. Why? Strategic. And some of the companions on top of that mount, only some, they disobeyed the simple instruction of the Prophet ﷺ. And when you think about the way that they disobeyed the instruction of the Prophet ﷺ, it was not that they committed a sin that you find in the Quran, or they openly sinned against Allah Azza wa Jal. No, it was a mistake that they made. because they assumed that the battle had ended, and they wanted, some of them, to partake in the collection of that which was left behind by the enemy, the opposition who had fled the battle sea. And so they came down from the mountain. And what happened? On the opposing side, who was one of the commanders? Khalid ibn al-Walid. And Khalid ibn al-Walid, as we know, Sayfullah, the sword of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a military genius. He saw this and he realized it's an opportunity. And so he took some of his soldiers and he came around from the other side of the mountain. The archers, the Sahaba on top of the mountain would have otherwise had that area covered. But they disobeyed the Prophet ﷺ. Some of them came down, there was an opening. So Khalid ibn al-Walid, he took some of the soldiers on horseback. He came from the opposite direction. And what happened? The Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba found themselves sandwiched in between two sides of the same opposing army. And a loss was suffered by the believers. Why? What's the moral of the story? The loss came from where? It did not come from a lack of military might. Quraysh had the upper hand militarily. Armor, weaponry, money, numbers. Quraysh had the upper hand. What was the issue? The issue was the disobeying of the Prophet ﷺ, which in turn is disobeying Allah Azza wa Jal. And loss was tasted. And so for us, when we look at the situation that we face today, we have to understand what's happening to our ummah. And the loss of the Sahaba in that instance came from what? What was the underlying issue? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, مِنْكُمْ مَن يُرِيدَ الدُّنْيَا. From you are those who want the dunya. Dunya is the problem. Dunya is the problem. It's not a lack of military might. It's not a lack of number. It's not a lack of ability. It's not a lack of strength. It's what? Love of dunya. Love of this life. And we look to Banu Israel. Allah Azza wa Jal informs us about them in so many places of the Quran. The children of Israel, the children of Yaqub alayhi salam. What happened to them? They were saved from Fir'aun. And who is Fir'aun? And of course the Fara'ina are many. But Al-Fir'aun, the great oppressor of his time, enslaved the children of Israel. Enslaved them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about Al-Bala'ul Azim, that they suffered at the hand of Fir'aun. The sons were slaughtered in front of their parents. And the women folk and the girls were left on the strings of life. The last strings of life were left in them. Why? So that they could be used to serve the nation of Fir'aun. And it's not only Fir'aun that was oppressive, it was his nation as well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, the nation of Fir'aun, they were oppressive. And they oppressed Banu Israel. What happened? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raised in the house of Fir'aun, Musa alayhi salam. And through Musa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought down the house of Fir'aun and brought down the oppression that came with it. And Allah Azza wa Jal, He did so in a fashion which was clear for all oppressors that came after Fir'aun to take heed in. Likewise clear for Banu Israel to understand this was not due to our own hands, this was from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Parting of the Red Sea, the sign sent to Fir'aun. But then what happened after? After having been saved, after having been selected by Allah Azza wa Jal to be His chosen people, the receivers of prophecy, the receivers of revelation, the receivers of kingdoms, the receivers of wealth. What happened? Allah instructed Musa alayhi salam to take Banu Israel and enter into which land? Palestine, the promised land. And what did they say? You and your Lord go and fight. We're going to stay right here. Why? Because there is a people in that land, Jabbareen. They are forceful and aggressive and harsh and coarse. They disobeyed Allah Azza wa Jal completely. And so what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what was the consequence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prescribed for that part of Bani Israel, at-Tih. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructed Musa alayhi salam to inform them that the land of Palestine is muharrama alayhim. 40 sana yatihuna fil ard. It's haram for them, forbidden for them to enter into that land for 40 years. Yatihuna fil ard. And they will wander the land. They will have no land to their own. They will not enter into Palestine. They will rather wander the land without a land to call their own for 40 years. Some of the ulama, they speak about the significance of this. And they say 40 years is the amount of time it takes or it took for the generation that was saved by Musa alayhi salam to die out, and a new generation to be raised by Musa and his successors upon the tarbiyah ilahiyah, nurturing upon what we would call today Islamic principles. Principles of liberation, liberation of the mind, liberation of the heart, along with liberation of the body. Why? Why did that generation of Banu Israel have to pass out? Why did they have to pass away? Because their bodies may have been liberated, but their hearts and their minds were not. Their hearts and their minds were enslaved. Enslaved to what? Dunya. And so again, the problem is what? Dunya. And so for us to reflect, when we look at what is happening in the world today, what is it that prevents us from contributing towards a change, not only for the sake of Islam and the Muslims, but for the sake of humanity, a positive change? What is it that stops us? What is it that keeps us in our homes at night, comfortable? What is it that keeps us attached to the ground? What is it that keeps us running after shadows? Dunya and love of dunya. And so if we really, really are sincere in wanting to aid the oppressed today, whether they are in Palestine, whether they are in Lebanon, whether they are here in the UK, what do we first need to do? We first need to liberate ourselves. Liberate ourselves from what? From the shackles of dunya. And that is a difficult task. And it requires first understanding how my heart is attached to this life. And that may be a bitter pill to swallow. For some of us, we may not want to admit that we're attached to this dunya. But it's the reality for most. Dunya can be good looks. Dunya can be fine clothes. Dunya can be fine foods. Dunya can be the warmth at night in the winter and the coolness in the day in the summer. Dunya. And there are others who their dunya is clear. Those who are running after the dunya and they're pursuing it through haram, clear. And some of these brothers, perhaps they have in their heart a love for Islam and a love for the Prophet ﷺ, but they've fallen into the traps of dunya and they're struggling to get out. For example, the drug dealers. For example, the robbers. For example, the alcohol sellers and the banksters and so on and so forth. For them it's straightforward. Leave off the dunya and quit the haram whilst you're ahead. For others that are not engaged in clear-cut haram lifestyles, perhaps it's the halal which is keeping you back. Perhaps it's the halal, perhaps too much food, too much clothing, too much finery. But we're all trapped. We're all trapped in this dunya, especially in the Western world. Especially in the Western world, we're trapped. Why? Because the Western world has been built to make you run after the dunya. Consumerism. Without your love of dunya, the economy does not exist in its current form. But from a Muslim perspective, the most important thing to be an upright and honest and sincere and good Muslim is learning to have self-control. And we are coming to Ramadan in a few months. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to meet Ramadan and He's pleased with us. The purpose of Ramadan is what? To teach the self to say no to itself. To teach ourselves to say no to the dunya. But that does not mean for the following 11 months we run after the dunya. No. And so for us to reflect, and when we look at the Sahaba and the people Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to be the followers of the Prophet ﷺ, there was a simplicity about them, a simplicity of lifestyle, a simplicity that they were not attached to this life. They were not attached to the dunya. And even those who had the dunya, when they accepted Islam, what did they do with it? They sold it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake. And we are coming to a time where we have to make decisions for many of us, especially those of us that are getting older. We sell our dunya for our akhirah, or we continue to chase after this dunya and live mediocre lives. And to be good Muslims is not to simply pray 5 times a day. That's not being a good Muslim. That's applying the foundation of Islam. Bunya al-Islamu ala khams. Bunya al-Islamu ala khams. In these times today, if I'm praying 5 times a day, yes, that's good. That's the floor, but we want to raise it. And we have to reflect. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله وحده وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء ومن تبعه وبعد. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, and we recite this verse often and we hear it often, especially for those who have a consistent relationship with the Quran. يا أيها الذين آمنوا استعينوا بالصبر والصلاة إن الله مع الصابرين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, oh, you who believe, seek aid through what? 2 things. As-sabri was-salah. The question that we should ask ourselves is what? Seek aid over what? Ista'inu ala madha. What is it that we are seeking Allah's aid over and in? Some of the ulama, some of the mufassirun, they say, seek aid from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your struggle against this dunya, bis-sabri was-salah, with patience and prayer. How? Patience upon that which the nafs finds difficult. Patience upon saying no to yourself. Patience upon staying away from sin. Patience upon lowering your gaze. Patience upon being broke and poor when you have the opportunity to make haram money. Patience. And then as-salah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does He tell us? Inna as-salata tanha 'anil fahsha'i wal munkar. That the prayer prevents a person from wickedness and illicit behavior. And so if I pray, it will aid me in staying away from that which is dislikable to Allah Azza wa Jal. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about the prayer, وَإِنَّهَا لَكَبِيرَةٌ إِلَّا عَلَى الْخَاشِعِينَ. That it is difficult, it is a burden, it's heavy, except upon who? Al-Khashi'een. And who are Al-Khashi'een? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the following verse, الَّذِينَ يَظُنُّونَ أَنَّهُمْ مُلَاقُوا رَبِّهِمْ وَأَنَّهُمْ إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Those who have conviction in the fact that they are going to meet Allah Azza wa Jal, and they know with certainty that to Him they are going to return. They understand that this place here is finite. This dunya is temporary. And they know that ultimately they are going to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they are going to return to Him shortly. The question though, the salah is kabira, it's difficult, except for the people of khushu'. The people of khushu' do not develop that khushu' except through what? Salah. So how do we get to that place where we are from the khashi'een if salah is difficult? The salah has to be difficult first in order for it to become easy. Sabr and salah. As the ulama of the past, they say, external taqwa leads to internal taqwa. And the internal taqwa that we ultimately want in the context of what we're talking about is to free ourselves from this life, the shackles and the chains of this dunya, to remove the chains that we cannot see around our necks and our hands and our legs, and to attach ourselves to Allah and to become Ibadur Rahman, the slaves and servants of Ar-Rahman, those who carry out His instruction on this earth. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala free our hearts from this dunya and aid us in being like those who have come before us, liberated from this life in servitude to Him. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. وارض اللهم عن أبي بكر وعن عمر وعن عثمان وعن علي وعن سائر الصحابة أجمعين. اللهم تب علينا واعف عنا إنك أنت العفو الكريم. اللهم انصر إخواننا في فلسطين وفي أنحاء العالم يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر الإسلام والمسلمين. اللهم ارفع راية الإسلام يا رب العالمين. اللهم عليك بالظالمين. اللهم خذهم فإنهم لا يعجزونك. وأقم الصلاة.